I think we can add Surya as the panelist.
Yeah, sounds good.
Hi, Surya. Can you check if you can turn on your video? Okay, perfect.
So we are currently live.
Awesome.
Hello.
Hello, Professor Bishop. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Professor.
So we'll be starting in 5 minutes.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Professor. Can you hear us?
Yes, I'm just trying to get my audio set up. Let's try that. That's better. Try again.
Hello. Hi, Professor.
Hi, Anvisa.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us today.
No, thank you for inviting me. This is great.
Thank you. So we are starting in around 5 minutes, waiting for others to join. And today we'll start with Professor Clara, who is the director of CSL. She'll be giving a welcome address, and then we'll start with your talk.
Okay. Will she introduce me? Is that the plan? How does this work?
So I was thinking of doing that myself. So
Okay,
I am
great,
one of
yeah.
the general chairs of
Great.
CSL Student Conference, and Ranveer is also one of the general chairs. So
Hi.
yeah, I'll be introducing you just before your talk.
And
So
can
the
I just
plan
do
is that. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So the plan is that I will introduce the conference for the first 2 or 3 minutes. Then Professor Clara will talk about CSL for around 20 minutes. And then Anvisha will introduce you. After
Okay.
that, we'll have your talk and Q&A.
That sounds good.
You know,
and you'll feed the questions to me, is that right?
Yes.
The questions come in on a chat window or something, but you'll read them out or pick the ones that you want. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So you would also we will filter it out for you. You would also have access to that yourself in case you you think we missed out on something. But
So that'll just be in the chat window, will it?
Yeah, it'll be in the Q&A.
Oh, the Q&A. Sorry. I'm not a Zoom user, as you could probably guess. So no questions so far. All right, that sounds good. And then can I try sharing my screen now? Will that be all right, or does that mess things
absolutely.
up?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
It'll stop others sharing. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me stop my sharing. Okay, can you try now?
Oh no, I don't want to do that. I want to do that. And are you seeing that screen?
Positive.
Yeah.
You're seeing the slides? Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I just leave this as it is, or?
So I think for the start, I think Clara is going to have.
Okay, so I should stop sharing.
Yeah, yeah. That we can share multiple screens, I think, but I think it would be. I think it would be glitchless if you can stop sharing and then restart the share.
Well, I'm happy to do that just as soon as I figure out where the stop sharing button is. So the Zoom sort of window all becomes quite small at this point. It's just showing me the video feeds. Is there a?
So there should be a top strip, a black colored strip, from where you can stop share.
So do you see anything in red which says stop share?
No, all I see now. I used to have a big screen. And suddenly, when I started sharing, it contracted to just a set of videos. So what does this do?
I see.
I see.
Oh dear,
You
no, I
might just be in full screen mode, and so just double click on your Zoom window, and that'll contract it again.
But even if that's not possible, it's fine. Like we can share on top of that, and then automatically your screen will stop share.
Right, but hang on. Hey, there's a thing over here. Right, okay. it's gone onto the other monitor. Stop sharing. There we go. Oh, and you're back again. All right. Okay. It's quite simple, really. I'm just not used to it.
Hi, Professor
Hi, Clara.
Clara.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. It's very exciting.
Right, exciting. Yeah, thank you so much for coming virtually to us.
No, thank you. It's great.
Great. So Ranveer, can I share the slides?
Yeah, so I have like 1 or 2 slides, and after
Yeah,
those slides for the introduction. So they will run for like 2 minutes.
Perfect.
And I will terminate on my side. So we are at 3:30, so let me start. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect. Hey everyone, very warm welcome to the 16th CSL Student Conference. I'm Ranveer Rana, one of the general co-chairs for the conference, along with Anvesha Chaudhary.
Hi.
We are very excited to hold this year's conference, as this is the 70th anniversary year of CSL. And thank you very much for being with us today in the middle of this global pandemic. Hope everyone is safe and healthy. Before starting, a little bit about the conference. The CSL Student Conference is a student-organized annual event of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The conference gathers scientists from academia and industry in a variety of fields. This year, we are very excited to have Professor Christopher Bishop from Microsoft Research, Cambridge, as our plenary speaker. Now, the conference constitutes of 4 technical sessions. Each session has a keynote speaker, an invited student speaker, and 4 other student speakers. We also have a robotics and poster session, a job fair, and a company workshop by our sponsors. The highlight of this conference is a special COVID-19 session, which is going to be organized tomorrow. The COVID-19 session will have eminent speakers from a broad range of areas like economics, healthcare, artificial intelligence, etc. You can visit our webpage for more details. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the faculty, student, and staff who have immensely helped us set up this conference. I would especially like to thank Professor Clara Nasrid, Norman Paquin, and Harold Javed for their advising roles and their help setting up this plenary talk. I would also like to thank CSL staff for their help ranging from setting up accounts, procurement, and marketing. Last but not the least, I would also like to thank our academic and corporate sponsors for supporting us this year. That being said, we have with us Director of CSL, Professor Clara. She is the Granger Distinguished Chair of Engineering Professor in the Department of CS at UIUC and a Director of CSL. She is an ACM Fellow, IEEE Fellow, AAAS Fellow, and a member of Leopoldina German National Academy of Sciences. We are excited to have you today. We request her to speak a few words on CSL before we start the talk from the plenary speaker. Professor Clara, welcome to the CSL Student Conference. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ranveer.
So stop my screen share.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this welcome session. And I would like to welcome everybody who is attending this plenary talk, as well as the CSL Student Conference. I would like to give a brief overview of CSL, since we are celebrating a very special birthday as an organization, and that is the 70th birthday. And so I would like to put into context where Coordinated Science Lab is. We are an interdisciplinary research organization with many multidisciplinary future leaders doing a lot of fundamental breakthroughs excellence in computing, communication, control, circuits. As you will see, actually, we also really pay attention to major impact as an organization and as members, so many members of the organization do. Our setup of the Coordinated Science Lab is that our really fundamental base are the groups. And there basically we very much rely on faculty and students and staff being coalesced within this particular group: circuits, electronics, computer systems architecture, precision and control, intelligent sensing, networking and cyber-physical systems, remote sensing, space sciences, security and privacy and technology, and societal impact. On top of these particular groups, very often faculty and students and staff come together to create centers. And so we have a really large number of centers. And actually, I want to, in this brief overview, also provide some insight what these particular centers are doing, since a lot of the impact you can see through these particular centers. Then when centers actually last a couple of years, then they do grow into institutes. And I want to particularly put forward the Information Trust Institute. And the centers, you can see really magnitude of a large number of centers funded through National Science Foundations, through Army Research Lab, through companies and so on. So a really, really large space that Coordinated Science Lab covers across the computing, communication, control, and circuits. Just to give you a feel how big we are at this point, we are truly a distributed organization with 135 faculty from 14 departments. The CSL Student Conference is a fantastic event because it brings together the 238 research assistants together, but also beyond that, since many of these department students are also participating. And of course, a lot of the research is being supported by the staff members, postdoctoral fellows, and visiting scholars. I do want to, before I go, a little bit of a 21st century research. I would like to give you a sense, since we are celebrating 70th birthday, of some of these aspects. We were born as an organization in 1951, and the first director was Dr. Seitz. And maybe some of you are also physics students, and there is a Seitz physics department, right, named after him. The first name of our organization was Control Systems Laboratory. And then 1959, it was renamed to a Coordinated Science Laboratory. The other aspect is that the building behind me here in my sort of background, that's a new building where we are currently, most of us, located. But the old building actually used to be the Engineering Science Building, but currently MRL is actually Material Research Lab. And we are actually growing, as you will see, currently this particular building, which is behind in my background, but then actually we also grew into CSL Studio. And we now also have an extension as an organization in the research park, the High Bay, that currently houses big experimental efforts from Center for Autonomy. Another thing I would like to put forward as a sort of fun fact is that the very first research results really came in air defense, radar, missile guidance, and one of the major contributors was also Professor John Bardeen, that many of you know through the Bardeen Quad, right? Here in the College of Engineering, and he was a physicist as well as engineer, and got Nobel Prize actually for transistors for his work in the Bell Laboratories. And he was a faculty here in the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the physics department, and contributed tremendously to many of the results, early 50s in Coordinated Science Lab. He was member of Coordinated Science Lab. So some of the really important inventions that happen in the Coordinated Science Lab, the gyrometer that all of you currently know in your mobile phone, which is very small, But at that time, this was a big invention, big devices you can see in that picture. There is, that was actually a very new type of navigation. And then, of course, came a lot of the development with respect to the computing. So CSL really became a coordinated lab because a lot of researchers came together to build the first digital computer, ORDVAC, from the Army. And then the second big computing effort was to create ELIAC. And then there were several versions of ELIAC. And I think all of you have heard that CSL was basically the birthplace for Plato to actually how to teach to use computers. And maybe some of the names, again, you are recognizing, like Dean Everett, who actually currently has the name of the Everett Lab right here on the quad of the College of Engineering. So a lot of sort of first things happened as the Plato was developed, graphic displays, first animation, first Star Wars movies, and so on. So a lot of first happened around the ELIAC and around the Plato in the 60s. So just to give you a very glimpse, we are actually an organization that can be proud of many first and inventions. I already mentioned the 50s, I mentioned the 60s, particularly reliable foundations, reliability, fault tolerance was very much, and dynamic control was studied here. 70s have tremendous contributions in solid state areas of semiconductors, but also we start to see first results in robotics and AI. Centers started to come, particularly in the supercomputing and nanoscale devices, quantum nanostructures. In the 90s, of course, then as the networking internet came together, mobile, and particularly CSL researchers have been tremendously dominant in networking, mobile wireless networking, and then signal processing, information theory compression, and e-security. And of course, in the 21st century, we are in an intelligent machine era, and they're basically mobile devices, AI, human cyber-physical systems. I actually want to briefly go through some of the inventions that are currently happening in the 21st century through various centers. But before I go there, I just want to sort of put into a context of the 70th birthday that 1963, the CSL Atherton Conference started, right? That is also very famous. And but I'm also very proud that the CSL has this now long-running CSL Student Conference that started in 2006. So it has a very proud place in the history of CSL. So I mentioned that CSL has major impact on specific research domains and areas through its fundamental research, theory or applied research in robotics, Internet of Things, cybersecurity, health. And I want to just show you some of those examples. So we have started a few years ago, Center for Autonomy. It's truly the continuation of the robotics effort that started in the 80s and 90s. Professor Mark Spong, maybe some of you already know, Professor Hutchinson and others, but now basically we have a true centers led by Professor Geert Delaruth that studies autonomy. And we have currently a gift of electric autonomous golf cart, the GEM, that maybe some of you have already driven and worked with. And this is particularly funded currently from the Investment of Growth proposal. This particular area is just snowballing. With the Center for Autonomy, fantastic facilities are currently connected. Please take use of it by reservation, talking to the Center of Autonomy Director and other members. We have an aerial arena in the CSL studio where UAVs can be flying. We have mobile arena where you can have mobile robots, but also there are these fixed robots where you can basically do your research. And then of course we have the high bay where basically it's a big warehouse where currently you can drive actually autonomous electric cars and study, and there is classes as well as research ongoing. I mentioned that AI is a very strong field and embedded in the coordinated science laboratory, and AI currently truly spans many different areas. Professor Elise Rosenbaum from the Camel Center, she actually currently leads the AI exploration within the microelectronic circuits and systems. And this particular project actually and center is studying machine learning algorithms to detect errors and then propagate, actually understand what kind of errors hardware might be providing, and providing that particular information to the software to actually react to any hardware errors. And as you can see, it's a very multi-institutional, multidisciplinary research center to actually explore these AI techniques that can help in error detection on the circuits on the hardware side. There is another NSF-funded IUCRC Industry and University Research Center led by Professor Ravi Iyer, and this is currently combining really health and data science and AI. This is currently in collaboration with the Mayo Clinic, where they are actually looking at the power of data analytics, machine learning, computation to advance health discovery and create actionable intelligence from multiple multi-omics big data. And so it's again very interdisciplinary collaboration between researchers as well as industrial representatives. Coordinated Science Lab also houses the ARL, Army Research Lab Center, Internet of Battlefield Things. This is currently led by Professor Tarek Abdelzaher. And here actually we are looking at Internet of Things, at sensors that are currently placed sort of in either first responder or battlefield type of environment. And the ultimate goal is to provide robust automation of the battlefield command and control, provide decision-making in highly dynamic environment, distributed coordination at ubiquitous scale, provide reliable and resilient operation at machine speeds, and provide actually future command and control information networks that truly require tighter integration across heterogeneous assets. Again, this is a joint collaboration among many different universities that contribute to this effort. More recently, actually, we opened up a center in the Coordinated Science Lab called CNICE, and this particular center is funded by the company, Foxconn Interconnect Technologies. The director of this particular center is Professor Placid Ferreira, and this particular center has truly the goal to innovate in smart factories, digital manufacturing, smart homes, smart robots, smart cars. So there is a co-robot project, there is a smart interconnect project. And so again, these are multi-interdisciplinary, multi-domain interdisciplinary type of research projects that aim to actually really bring the cyber infrastructure, bring the algorithms, bring the AI techniques into digital manufacturing, smart factories, and smart homes. Another very important center that is currently already for many years a major asset to the College of Engineering as well as to Coordinated Science Laboratory is the Healthcare Engineering System Center. This particular Healthcare Engineering System Center is led by Professor Kesavadas. It is funded by Jump Arches and particularly sort of through this particular funding, we saw major investment into the COVID-19 activities in 2020. And so some of the really important tokens that we have seen are the new design of the N95 masks, and then the production. HCESC participated in that. New rapid testing technologies, tracing and tracking for campus. Actually, HCESC has been very much part of the SHIELD operation that probably many of you have saw the Safer Illinois application that has been developed here for testing, saliva testing, And HCESC has been very much part of that particular effort. And telemedicine, home monitoring, which is very important now in the COVID-19 times. And one sort of particular instrument that I want to actually stress is the UV bot, which is a programmable robot that inactivates the COVID-19 virus with UV light. And you can basically have it run in schools, in offices, and with the UV light, that particular virus get destroyed. And one of the, I think, important aspect, that's why I also mentioned schools, is that this particular instrument, this particular robot is very much built under $1,000 so that it is affordable for many of the schools. Last but not least, in terms of the centers, I want to, or institutes, I want to mention the Information Trust Institute. Information Trust Institute is led by Professor David Nichol. Again, this is a institute that is started early 2000, and it's really investigating security, privacy, and trust, particularly trust in complex systems. So it's also not only security and privacy, but also reliability, anomaly detection, intrusion detection, and so on. So many different aspect dimensions of security and trust and privacy. As you can actually see, this institute again brings together many different researchers that are investigating these aspects of trust, and the tokens and results in this particular institute are looking at trust in critical infrastructure, such as, for example, smart grid, and then evaluate this particular trust and security using data science and using other sort of achievements in coordinated science laboratories. So problems that we are at this point investigating within the Information Trust Institute is looking at trust in SCADA networks for smart grids, looking at real-time data analytics, and part of this particular institute are again some smaller and interdisciplinary centers like the Boeing Assured Software Center or the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute funded by the DHS, or the Cyber-Physical Experimental Environment for Radix that is funded currently by DARPA. So you can see that this particular set of new inventions and innovation in the 21st century are truly addressing a lot of the societal problems. But of course, none of this would be possible without our young researchers, the students and postdocs in the coordinated science lab. And so the engagement of the students is very strong, which I'm very happy about that. And these are some pictures from the past CSL student conferences. That's a very strong event for us in the Coordinated Science Lab. The CSL student conference job fair that you just had virtually, but it's always a very, very important event for this conference. And then just getting together. So my recommendation is that use the virtual hangout this year that the organizers created with the Gather Town, because as you can see on this particular picture, a lot of ideas get exchanged when you meet in these free times. CSL also, when we have been in person, we have a CSL social hour where people learn all kinds of research about their fellow students. And then of course, we started actually a interdisciplinary PhD thesis award to actually award students who are really invested and are doing research in this particular interdisciplinary field. So I believe that this is currently really our future. And therefore, I am very happy to be here at the CSL Student Conference. I wish you good luck, and please enjoy the 16th CSL Student Conference, even though it's virtual. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Clara, for your wonderful talk. It was really inspiring to learn about the rich history of CSL and the technical innovations that came out of it, and that we are still doing such relevant work. It was very inspiring. Thanks a lot. So with that, let's move to our plenary session. So let me share my screen briefly. So as we all know, today we are very excited to have with us Professor Christopher Bishop from Microsoft, who of course needs no introduction. Any student who works in machine learning or a related field would have definitely referred to his books. A little bit about him. So Professor Christopher Bishop is a Microsoft Technical Fellow and Laboratory Director of the Microsoft Research Lab in Cambridge, UK. He is also the Professor of Computer Science at the University of Edinburgh and a Fellow of Darwin College, Cambridge. In 2004, he was elected Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. In 2007, he was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And in 2017, he was elected Fellow of the Royal Society. Now at Microsoft Research, Professor Bishop oversees a world-leading portfolio of industrial research and development with a strong focus on machine learning and AI, and creating breakthrough technologies in cloud infrastructure, security, workplace productivity, computational biology, and healthcare. So Professor Chris obtained a BA in physics from Oxford and a PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Edinburgh with a thesis on quantum field theory. After his PhD, he joined the theoretical physics division of the Culham Lab, where he conducted research into the physics of magnetically confined fusion plasmas. During his time, he developed an interest in machine learning and became the head of the Applied Neurocomputing Center at AEA Technology. He was subsequently elected to a chair in the Department of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics at Aston University, where he set up and led the Neural Computing Research Group. And as we all know, Professor Bishop is the author of two highly cited and widely adopted machine learning textbooks, The Neural Networks for Pattern Recognition and Pattern Recognition and Machine Learning. He has also worked on a broad range of applications for machine learning domains, ranging from computer vision to healthcare. Professor Bishop is a keen advocate of public engagement in science. And in 2008, he delivered the prestigious Royal Institution Christmas Lectures, established in 1825 by Michael Faraday and broadcast on national television. Also, Professor Chris is a member of the UK AI Council. He was also recently appointed to the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. So today we are delighted to have him with us. The title of his talk today is The Real AI Revolution. So a few points to mention. There will be a question and answer session at the end for around 15 minutes. If you have questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A section. Or if you're a panelist, you could also just ask the questions directly. If you are an attendee but would like to ask the question yourself, please let us know and we will give you permission to unmute yourself and then ask it. With that, without any further delay, let's welcome Professor Bishop. Hi, Professor.
Hello. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you today. Are you able to share your screen, Professor?
Did I share? I think I did. Are you not seeing it?
I can see it. I can see it.
You can see it? Great. Okay,
Excellent.
fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. So, well, thank you, Annalise, for that fantastic introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I'm going to talk about AI, and obviously there's a lot of excitement around AI right now, and you might wonder, is that excitement really justified? The answer is I believe it is, but for a rather specific reason. I'm going to call that the real AI revolution, and that's really the subject of this talk. So I thought I'd begin by asking a simple question, which is, what is AI? Now, probably the best answer that I've heard to this question was actually given by Lewis Carroll in his book, Through the Looking Glass. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. Well, in the case of AI, apparently you can. So this is a survey conducted in 2019 by a company called MCC Ventures. It's a London-based company. And by the way, you still hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Fantastic. My video just froze there. This is a survey in 2019 by a company called MCC Ventures, a London-based company, and they surveyed nearly 3,000 European companies who claim to be using AI. They found that 40% of them do not use anything that computer scientists would recognize as AI or machine learning. So that's rather interesting. And the term AI then seems to mean whatever people want it to mean. I think that's one of the reasons why other terminologies have emerged. And one of them is so-called AGI, artificial general intelligence, the idea of AI really meaning the ability to give machines the full rich cognitive capabilities of the human brain. And in fact, just from a personal point of view, I have a background in theoretical physics, but I moved into machine learning nearly 30 years ago, and more than that, in fact, because of really a fascination with the idea of building machines that could learn, that might one day have the full intelligence of the human brain. And I was really inspired by the work of Hinton and others on neural networks and the development of backpropagation. Now, here's another survey then of, in this case, it's nearly 1,000 AI researchers, and it asked them to give a date by which they thought there would be a 50-50 probability of achieving artificial general intelligence. Now, the most optimistic of these was a futurologist you may have heard of called Ray Kurzweil. He thought we'd get there by 2030. At the other end of the spectrum was the roboticist Rodney Brooks, who was much more pessimistic. He thought it would be 2200, the end of the next century, before we get there. But the median response was around the year 2040. So I think we conclude a couple of things from this. The first one, of course, is that nobody really has a clue whether we'll get to artificial and general intelligence, let alone when we will get there. But the other thing is that it's clearly going to be a long way off, probably decades away at least. So the question is, should we be excited about artificial intelligence today? And the answer is, I think we should. And I'll call this the real AI revolution. So what do I mean by the real AI revolution? Well, it's really a revolution in the way that we create software. And I think one way to express it is this. For the last 40 years, we've programmed computers, and for the next 40 years, we're going to train them. So it's really a transformation in the way we create software. And because virtually all technology today depends on software, whether it's an electric toothbrush or a spacecraft that lands on Mars, it's really a revolution in the way we create technology. It's really quite, I think, quite fundamental. And I'll hope to convince you of that as we go through the talk. So one thing that's clear is that machine learning is becoming ubiquitous. One reason for that, of course, is that it's able to solve many problems that we couldn't solve any other way. Attempts to have computers understand visual scenes, interpret images, and so on, translate speech into text, and many other things, really had very poor performance and really got stalled until fairly recently. And we had so-called deep neural networks that really unlocked the potential of machine learning. And today there are many problems that we can solve, but we can only solve them using machine learning. But I think it's actually much more than that. One of the interesting aspects of machine learning is really this ability to produce custom solutions. If you think about a software company such as Microsoft, go back 20 or 30 years, Microsoft would produce software, Windows, Office, and so on. It would be very complex software, millions of lines of code written by thousands of developers. It would be very, very expensive to produce. But then very, very cheap to replicate, just copying some optical discs and shipping them around the world. But it's a sort of one size fits all. Everybody gets, apart from perhaps customizing to French, German, English, whatever, it's really sort of one size fits all. It's just not feasible or practical to have developers create custom software for each individual person if you've got hundreds of millions of customers. But machine learning can really do that. It can adapt automatically and customize to an individual person, to a specific sensor, to a factory, a smart city, whatever it might be. So that's really, again, part of the power of machine learning. So for me, this is really a pervasive and transformational impact that we're seeing from machine learning. It doesn't have a lot to do with artificial intelligence in the sense of AGI, but it's nonetheless important and nonetheless exciting, in my view, for that. And it's very real and it's happening today. So just to give you a little bit more insight, really, into why this is such an exciting time for the field, This is a graph, and I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see all the details on this. The exact details don't matter, but on the horizontal axis, we have date. So it goes from 1960 on the left all the way through to 2021, the present day, on the right-hand side. And the vertical axis is the amount of compute, the number of compute cycles needed to train the state of the art in machine learning at that particular date. And the units of this are petaflops days, so 10 to the 15 floating point operations per second for a day. That's a petaflops day. And the top of this graph is 10 to the 4, 10,000 petaflops days. So, and then scattered on this graph are various sort of state-of-the-art landmark machine learning algorithms and technologies in each era. We see things like the perceptron from the 1960s, and NetTalk from the late 1980s, LeNet5, and deep belief networks, and so on. If you sort of fit a straight line to these, you'll see the straight line provides actually a pretty good fit, and its straight line has an upward slope. Because the vertical axis is a logarithmic axis, this represents exponential growth. And so in fact, what we've done here, we've just rediscovered Moore's law. The slope of this line represents a doubling in the number of compute operations required about every 2 years. So that's really a consequence of Moore's law and the associated doubling of compute power every couple of years. But then something really remarkable happened around the year 2012. And of course, that was the beginning of the deep learning revolution. And we see some more examples of things like AlexNet, ResNet, machine translation, AlphaGo, and so on. And again, they fit remarkably well to a straight line. But now the slope is much steeper. In fact, this line represents an exponential growth with a doubling time of just under 3.5 months. In other words, this represents a factor of 10 increase in compute power every year. And we see that's been sustained from 2012 up to the present day and looks set to continue. It's quite an extraordinary exponential growth. And of course, it's been made possible by investments in very large scale compute, large arrays of GPUs. I mean, we were lucky because the GPU, the graphics processing unit architecture, is very well suited to training neural networks. But more recently, specific architectures and silicon is being developed, tuned specifically for machine learning training. And then we build large clusters of thousands of these connected together with high-speed networking and so on in order to stay on this curve. And why is this? Why are people and researchers so interested in piling in more and more compute power? Well, it's because of an observation that with these deep learning architectures, if you increase the size of the network, if you increase the amount of data available, and that requires an associated increase in the amount of compute, then you find there is gold. There is a commensurate return in terms of the capabilities and performance of these systems. And I suppose the canonical example these days would be the natural language models, things like GPT, the generative pre-trained transformers from OpenAI, and similar models from various tech companies, including Microsoft. These are very, very large-scale natural language models requiring enormous amounts of compute power. And that trend looks set to continue, and certainly people are eagerly awaiting the next sort of round of these models and anticipating increased performance. So tremendously exciting time to be in the field of machine learning. And we can look at that in a slightly different way. That previous graph was from OpenAI, and as is this is also adapted from a graph in OpenAI. And this is looking not at compute power, but a sort of related quantity, which is the number of adjustable parameters, number of weights and biases in the neural network. And again, the horizontal axis here is the number of parameters, but again, it's on this exponential scale. And then just for fun, it's been labeled up with the equivalent number of parameters in various sort of organisms, going from ant and bee and lizard through rat and fish up to monkey and human on the right-hand side. So what does that mean? Well, I'm sure you all know that the very simplistic way, at the heart of what happens in things like the human brain, it's an electrical circuit built out of electrically active cells called neurons, and these neurons connect to each other through junctions called synapses. And the neurons are interesting, but the most interesting thing is the synapses. Each neuron makes tens of thousands of connections or synapses with other neurons. And the synapses are really the main seat of learning. It's the adaptation and the strength of these synapses is the principal mechanism by which these biological neural networks can learn. And I thought I'd just show you a little analogy to give you a sense of the scale here, because it's really quite staggering. People say the human brain is the most complex object in the known universe. And here's a little analogy to give you a sense of scale. This shows a map of South America, and outlined in red there is the Amazon rainforest. It's absolutely massive, and there's the United Kingdom shown for scale. And the number of neurons in a human brain is the same order of magnitude as the number of trees in the Amazon rainforest. So it's a staggering number. But I said it's not the neurons that are interesting, it's the connections between them, the synapses. And the number of synapses in the human brain is of the same order as the number of leaves on the trees of the Amazon rainforest. So it's a truly staggering number. So where are we with our artificial neural networks? Well, I mentioned GPT-2, the language model that was really a landmark breakthrough in language modeling and language understanding. GPT-2 had 1.5 billion parameters. By comparison, the human brain has of order 100 trillion synapses. And so it's interesting to see on this extraordinary exponential scale that we're on now, how long might it take us before we get to the scale of the human brain? And I should emphasize that nobody here I don't think from OpenAI, and I certainly don't believe that simply scaling these models up to the scale of 100 trillion parameters is going to give us artificial general intelligence or anything like it. It's just simply an interesting way of labeling up this scale, and we'll be curious to see when we get to the same scale as the human brain. Well, this graph was originally produced with GP2 on it, so it's pretty out of date now. We've already had GPT-3 a couple of years later. So 2 years later, that's a factor of 100 growth in scale. So GPT-3, 175 billion parameters. And we've already seen early this year the emergence of the first models with 1 trillion parameters. So we seem still to be continuing on that extraordinary growth, and certainly very exciting to see where this goes over the next year or two. So I said that in this real AI revolution, it's not just a bunch of applications of machine learning. It's something much more fundamental. It's to do with the way we create solutions. Instead of handcrafting algorithms, we instead program machines to be adaptive, and we train them using data. And I also said this was really becoming ubiquitous. And so I wanted to illustrate this with some examples. Now, there are probably thousands of examples I could give at this point, but obviously I'm going to choose some examples from my own research lab. And the particular one that I wanted to show you here is a project that this has been going a few years, but it was actually fairly secretive until recently. It's only really towards the end of last year that we first made this public. And so I haven't had really many opportunities to talk about this publicly. And so I thought this would be a nice example. So this is a research project whose goal is to create an entirely new way of storing data. And the target here are the disk drive, the hard disk drives in a data center. So data centers, huge data centers, ran full of enormous numbers of hard disk drives storing massive amounts of data. The amount of data is growing exponentially, as you can probably imagine. And we need a way of storing that data that's very reliable, that's fast, and that's cheap. Now, there are really a couple of ways of doing that. We can use hard disk drives. They're pretty ubiquitous. They've been around a long time. They're cheap, relatively speaking, but they're pretty slow because a read head has to move physically across the disk, and the disk is spinning. It's all very mechanical, so it's cheap, but it's slow. The alternative is solid state disks based on silicon, no moving parts, very much faster, but they're much more expensive. And so the goal here is to create a new technology that gives us very high performance, as we'd get from a solid state disk drive, but give us low cost to compete with hard disk, physical spinning hard disks. And the technology here is based on storing data in the form of holograms. And these are overlapping holograms stored inside a crystal. And the idea has actually been around for quite a few decades, but it was never considered to be practical. why are we visiting this now? We're visiting this now because of the availability of cheap hardware, commodity hardware. And the reason is in your pocket, it's to do with the smartphone. The development of the smartphone has meant that some very powerful hardware technology is available at remarkably low cost. And so we think that's transformational in allowing this technology to become reality, but it's critically dependent, as you'll see, on machine learning. So let me first of all just explain how this works. This is a thing a bit like a Michelson interferometer for the physicist amongst you. We have a laser, and the laser goes into a beam splitter, and the beam is split along two paths. And one of those paths is reflected off a screen. And the screen here is rather like the screen in your smartphone. So very high resolution, very powerful technology, but relatively cheap because it's mass produced. And so the screen carries an image, and that image is the encoding as a 2D image of the data that you wish to store. So that image is then focused into the crystal. And so that the light from that screen passes through a lens and into the crystal. And there it combines with the light from the other beam, the so-called reference beam. And where the two beams meet, there's an interference pattern, and the peaks of intensity in that interference pattern cause electrons to be promoted from the ground state into some metastable state. So this is a non-volatile form of memory, at least on the time scale that we're talking about here. Those electrons sit in the metastable state and they capture that information. And so the data has now been stored in the form of this hologram. Now, the other thing we can do is that reference beam bounces off a mirror, but the mirror itself is a small micromechanical mirror that can move just tiny amounts or a tiny angle. But by changing the angle of that beam, we can store another hologram, which actually overlaps with the first one, but is distinct from it. And so that's the process of writing the data. And then when we want to come to read the data, we just use the reference beam. So we bounce the reference beam off the MEMS mirror into the crystal. It's scattered, and then the scattered light is directed through a lens onto a camera. And again, that camera builds on the kind of technology that you have in your smartphone. Very high resolution camera produced at very low cost. And of course, we want to use this crystal efficiently, so we can produce in any one region overlapping holograms. And then there are many of these regions, so we fill the whole crystal potentially with data, and it can live there for, relatively speaking, long periods of time. And then when we need to erase the data, we just use ultraviolet light, and that allows the electrons to relax back to the ground state, and then we can repeat the process again. So it's an erasable and rewritable memory. So that's the basic physics behind the idea of holographic storage. Now, the question is, what has this got to do with machine learning? Well, let's just look at the data flow through this system. So we'll start with the user data. And the first thing is to do the write process that I described, whereby the data is written as a hologram inside the crystal. Now, the data typically will be compressed. It may be encrypted, both of which tend to turn it into pseudo-random numbers. No system is perfect at reading back data. So just like with hard disk drives and other storage systems, we'll add error correction codes so that we can recover from bit errors. In the physics process, we can use software to recover the errors by adding additional error correcting bits to the data before it's written. So that's the write process. Then we follow the read process that I've described, and that gives rise to these images captured on a camera. There's a bit of pre-processing to do with some optics correction. We get a pre-processed signal. And we're now going to use machine learning to decode that signal. Now, we're going to use a neural network. It's actually a deep convolutional type of deep convolutional neural network. And that neural network, of course, is computationally expensive to train. But once it's trained, it can decode data very fast because it's just a feed-forward process. It takes a fixed amount of time. It can run very fast on appropriate parallel hardware, and so it can be extremely quick. And the output of the neural network is a probability distribution over a vocabulary of symbols. These symbols are just short bit strings. And from that, we can apply the error correction algorithm, and unscramble the data and recover the user data. And then we can compare the original ground truth user data with the recovered data, and that gives an error signal. And that error signal can be used to drive, through backpropagation, to drive gradient-based optimization of the parameters in that neural network. Now, this is a very interesting application of machine learning. It's a very challenging application because normally you might think that if you are 99% accurate, then you'd be doing pretty well. But in this particular application, 99% accuracy is not good enough. We need to be orders of magnitude better than that. But the good thing is this is sort of an ideal application for machine learning because, first of all, this data, because of compression and encryption and so on, it's effectively pseudo-random. We can actually even just use a random number generator and generate synthetic data. So the data itself is not, it's not like healthcare data. It's not personally identifiable. It's not sensitive data. We don't have to worry about GDPR and things like that. It's just random numbers effectively. The next nice property is that it's perfectly labeled. So if you think about a classical machine learning application where you're trying to recognize objects in images, it may be cheap to collect the images, but then each image has to be labeled according to the objects it contains. That's often done by humans. It's slow and it's expensive. Here, this synthetic data is automatically perfectly labeled because we know the data we start with, so we have perfect labels. And then finally, we all know that these deep learning architectures are tremendously hungry in terms of quantity of data. And sometimes that can be a limitation, but again, here it's synthetic data. We can easily generate unlimited quantities of that data. So it's a great application for machine learning, which is just as well because we're going to demand very, very high performance and accuracy from this. Now, machine learning is an interesting approach. It outperforms classical techniques, but what's particularly valuable here is that we want to make use of that cheap commodity hardware, that mass-produced mobile phone hardware. And although the performance of that hardware is extraordinary for the price, it is not high precision laboratory grade research hardware. It is sort of cheap hardware, mass-produced. And one of the great things about machine learning is that it can automatically adapt to the specifics of each instance of that hardware, effectively a kind of very sophisticated form of calibration to take account of the characteristics of the particular system, including the camera and the screen and so on. And indeed, if the system drifts in some way over time, then the machine learning can automatically recalibrate if needed. There's actually more we can do with machine learning in this application. This is still a research project. We do aspire that one day this technology will be used at scale in data centers around the world, but right now we've got to work to further improve the performance and the accuracy of the system. And there are lots and lots of parameters that can be tuned to do with the physics of how the data is read and written and read back and so on, and the way it's processed. So there's lots and lots of experimentation to be done. And so we use machine learning in a kind of outer loop to help with that as well. So if you think about that error signal between the initial data and the recovered data, that error signal can also, the residual error after we train the neural network, can itself be a signal to drive that outer loop of experimentation. So we can, we start in some particular place in parameter space to do with the angles of the lasers and the density of data and so on. And we train up the system, we optimize it, train up the neural network, and we have some residual error. We use that as a sample for techniques like Bayesian optimization, machine learning based optimization, probabilistic optimization algorithms, which can then advise on where next to look in parameter space. And what's really interesting is that our laser labs in our lab in Cambridge in the UK are really quite highly automated. So a lot of that outer loop exploration driven by this outer loop of machine learning can actually be done automatically. So again, a really nice example of machine learning being applied to help, in this case, help speed up the research process. So we're very excited about that application. So Machine learning, of course, at the heart of machine learning is machine learning algorithms. And for the first sort of 25 years that I was in the field, we were all focused on trying to get the algorithms to work really well. That the goal was to sort of get a better error rate than the previous year and get your paper published at NeurIPS and so on. But today we're seeing machine learning really land in the real world, in thousands of real world applications. And what that really is highlighting for us is that although the algorithms are clearly key, when you actually want to build real world applications used by real people, it becomes a very, very multidisciplinary undertaking. It's not enough just to have machine learning experts. You need engineers to build robust, scalable software. You need to worry about security because there'll be adversaries attacking your system. You need to think hard about the ethics of what you're doing and about privacy. You need to think about the human experience and what the user experience is going to be like. And you need domain knowledge. You need to work with human experts. And that may seem a little surprising because we hear a lot about machine learning displacing humans and replacing experts. And we hear a lot of examples of machine learning achieving human level performance in various scenarios and tasks. And so what is the role of human expertise? So let me just say a few words about human expertise. So let's look at an example. An example of human expertise might be a dermatologist, that is a specialist looking at the skin, and in particular they'll be looking at skin lesions and trying to understand whether those lesions are benign or malignant, whether they're cancer or not. And so this is a good example of human expert knowledge that's based on experience. So the dermatologist gains experience when they're at medical school, they read the medical books, then they become a junior doctor, they see lots of patients as their careers progress, they see more and more examples of these lesions, and they eventually learn through biopsies and through looking at the outcome, they learn which ones are cancerous and which ones are benign. And based on that experience, they get better and better at predicting whether a particular lesion is going to be cancer or not. Now, that kind of experience, that's exactly what machine learning is really good at, looking at lots and lots of images of cancer, lots and lots of images of not cancer, and learning how to tell them apart. And in fact, a paper published in Nature, actually made it to the front cover of Nature a couple of years ago, showed that deep neural networks can achieve and exceed human level performance, can exceed the performance of the best humans and can outperform most average dermatologists in making these decisions. And what's more, the capability of the human dermatologist is probably not improving particularly fast year on year, whereas there's a real sense the machine learning is just getting going. There's lots of scope to try new architectures, new algorithms, put more data at this and so on. So it appears that dermatologists are going to be out of a job fairly soon. Well, actually, that's not the case at all. In fact, the dermatologists I've spoken to are actually very excited by this technology, because one of the things that gives them sleepless nights is the fear they've made the wrong diagnosis. And if there's some technologies that can help them make the right diagnosis, they're actually very enthusiastic about it. So I think this was nicely summarized by Felix Nenser, who said, AI will not replace radiologists, but radiologists who do not use AI will be replaced by those who do. In other words, it's a very powerful technology that complements and augments human capability. And so I want to illustrate that with another example. Again, it's a project taken from the Microsoft Research Lab, in this case, again, the one in Cambridge, UK, that I look after. This is not from the field of radiology, it's from an adjacent field called radiation oncology. Now, health is actually a major focus area for Microsoft all up and for Microsoft Research, including from my lab. We've been interested for a number of years in the domain of machine learning for medical imaging. There are many groups around the world in academia and in hospitals, in industry, who are interested in machine learning and computer vision for medical imaging. We're particularly focused on delivering this in the real world. So we're not, we publish papers, but our goal is not just to publish. Our real goal is to help patients and help clinicians in the real world. That's always our focus. So this is what radiation oncology is all about. It's about precision radiotherapy. In developed countries, something like 50% of us will eventually develop some form of cancer. And those who have cancer, again, about 50% of those will have some form of radiation treatment. And so this is using radiation. On the left there, you see that big machine is a linear accelerator. It produces very precise controlled radiation that can be targeted at a tumor. and can hopefully kill off the tumor while causing minimal damage to the surrounding healthy tissue. Now, that machine requires an execution plan. It requires software instructions telling it precisely where the radiation is to be fired in 3 dimensions. In order to do that, it's necessary to take, first of all, a 3-dimensional scan of the patient. It's either a computer tomography scan based on X-rays, or maybe an MRI, 3D imaging scan, magnetic resonance imaging, 3D scan. And then a radiation oncologist, this is our collaborator Raj, he's seen here taking one of those 3D scans and segmenting it. He goes through it. This is the standard workflow in hospitals around the world. You go through the 3D scan, 2D slice by 2D slice, and with a stylus, you mark the outline of the tumor. And that's the segmentation. And that's used then to plan the radiation treatment that will be delivered by that linear accelerator. Now, the challenge for this is that it's a very slow and tedious and time-consuming process. Even for simple tumors, it can take anything up to 20 minutes. If the tumor has metastasized, there are many, many regions of tumor, it can take many hours. So it's a very time-consuming process. So we've brought the power of machine learning to bear on this, and we use techniques such as 3-dimensional convolutional neural networks, such as the UNet architecture, which is a type of convolutional network developed specifically for segmentation of medical images. Tens of millions of parameters trained on large clusters of GPUs. One interesting thing is that a lot of research in this area is done on data taken from a single institution. So a researcher will collaborate with a nearby hospital, they'll get hold of some data, they'll use that to train the neural network, they'll hold out some of the data and then measure the performance on that held out data, and that will determine the accuracy, the generalizability they have. But we want to actually use this in clinical practice. And in clinical practice, we need to be robust against the variabilities between one institution and another, variations in the protocols and the procedures that are used. And so we found it's tremendously important to use data from many different institutions. We work across Australia, Europe, New Zealand, North and South America to make sure that we are able to generalize from one institution to another. And here's just an example of some results. So you'll see on the left some segmentations of, in this case, vital organs. We segment the organs as well as the tumors. On the left, obtained from holdout data from the training set. But then on the right-hand side, you see some further examples of segmentations produced by the neural net on data from different institutions. And we compare the contours generated by the machine with contours generated by humans. And we've reached the point where the errors from the machine learning model fall well within the range of variability across different human experts. So it's the accuracy is comparable, at least with that of human experts. And we also get consistent results across different hospitals. One final point to make about this is that the clinician looks at the segmentation produced by the neural network. The human is still in the loop. So the clinician the radiation oncologist will look at the segmentation from the neural network, and they'll make changes by hand. They'll use their expertise to fine tune it. They can add regions or subtract regions in what is a fairly fast process. They don't have to do the bulk segmentation. They simply have to review the segmentation and make any changes if they feel those are necessary. And very often they're happy with the initial output from the neural network. But it's important that it's the radiation oncologist who's still signing off on the segmentation. Of course, that makes it much easier to get approval to use this technology in clinical practice. And of course, we do some very careful scholarly studies of the performance of the system. Here's a little summary of the case of head and neck segmentation from computer tomography tumors, where the reduction in the average time taken to do a segmentation is from 73 minutes on average for the hand segmentation, that's the current workflow in most hospitals, down to 5 minutes using inner eye. And that 5 minutes includes the time taken to correct any inaccuracies from the neural network. It's the actual end-to-end time in the real clinical workflow. And in some cases, the time savings can be even greater than you see here. Now, I said our goal in this was to see this in clinical practice. This is Raj Jenna. He's one of our main collaborators and partners in this project. He's a consultant radiation oncologist at Addenbrooke's Hospital. It's part of Cambridge University, and it's one of Europe's largest teaching and research hospitals. It's on our doorstep. And recently, Addenbrooke's Hospital announced that this will now be used in clinical practice as a matter of routine. People going to Addenbrooke's Hospital presenting with solid tumours needing radiation oncology will benefit from the use of inner eye to provide the segmentations needed to plan that therapy. So tremendously exciting. This is the first hospital to adopt this in clinical practice. We hope it will be the first of many. It's an open source project. You can go to GitHub and go to Inner Eye Deep Learning if you want to learn more about the project. So we're absolutely delighted by that. So on the subject of healthcare, I want to talk about another healthcare project, which again illustrates some exciting things we can do with neural networks. A rather different project, and in particular, a project which has been going for a number of years. It's a collaboration that we set up back in 2018. But in the spring of last year, with the outbreak of the pandemic, we paused the research we were doing and we pivoted to look at COVID-19. So this is a partnership with a company, a Seattle-based company called Adaptive Biotechnologies. And their specialist capability is sequencing the DNA that codes for the receptors on the surface of T cells. Now, T cells are a type of white blood cell that are part of our adaptive immune system. And there's special DNA that's effectively scrambled when the T cells are made, and that makes these T cells. They have these unique receptors on the surface, and it's part of this very powerful adaptive immune system whereby the human body can recognize an invader, even though it's never seen the invader before. It recognizes that there's something has arrived in the body that's foreign to the body, and it can mount an immune response. And so the idea here is you'll take a blood sample from somebody. We'll use adaptive biotechnologies, sophisticated immunosequencing technology to sequence the specific DNA coding for these T cell receptors. That data will be fed into our machine learning in the cloud. Machine learning will run, and the output of this will be things like disease endpoints for diagnostics and the known antigens associated with disease for things like therapeutics and vaccine. So the goal here is to essentially use machine learning to learn the relationship between those T cell receptors, those pseudo-random receptors associated on the surface of these T cells, and the associated antigens. The antigens are short amino acid sequences to which those T cell receptors bind, and they're in turn associated with specific diseases. And in a typical blood sample, there may be about 1 million T cells, each genetically programmed to target a specific antigen, and our goal is to learn the relationship between the T cell receptors and the antigens. So as I said, we pivoted to look at COVID-19 back in spring of last year, and COVID-19 is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So when somebody breathes in that virus, they become infected. The virus invades a cell, hijacks the machinery of the cell, and reprograms it to manufacture more copies of the virus. And that virus is then released into the body, and the virus particles go and invade other cells. And the process continues as the infection takes hold. The body then mounts an immune response, and then hopefully sometime later, the person then recovers fully, we hope, from the infection. So let's dive down a little bit more deeply and understand how this works. So there are cells called antigen presenting cells that will take in a virus particle and break it up into pieces and then present the pieces at the surface of the cell so they can be sort of sniffed, as it were, detected by these T cells. And there are a couple of important classes of T cell here. There are the so-called killer T cells, the CD8 T cells. They will detect the fragments presented at the surface, the antigens presented at the surface of the antigen-presenting cell. And when they find a match, they undergo clonal expansion. They make identical copies of themselves, so all of the copies will detect the same antigens, and they then go off and attack the virus. Now, there's another kind of T cell, the so-called helper T cells, the CD4 T cells. When they detect an antigen, when they recognize an antigen, they find a match, they also undergo clonal expansion, and they then assist in priming the killer T cells to attack the invader. And they also prime another class of white blood cells called B cells, and the B cells produce antibodies. So there's this sort of multi-pronged attack, the killer C cells attacking directly, and then the antibodies also providing another line of defense. Now, what's interesting is that in longitudinal, the final thing, of course, is that eventually when you recover from, hopefully you recover from the infection, most of these T cells go away, but some of them persist. They're called memory T cells, and that's part of the adaptive immune system. It means next time you're infected with the same or a similar a pathogen, your body's already primed to respond, and so you can respond much faster and suffer much less severely for the next time that you're infected, or perhaps avoid serious infection altogether. So that's a part of your immunity that you've acquired as a result of the infection. Now, the antibodies decay over time, but what's interesting is the T cells persist for much longer periods. And so one of the things, even between the spring of last year and the end of last year, was this research, this collaborative partnership with Adaptive, allowed Adaptive to launch a new test for COVID-19 called T-Detect COVID. And it's the first test for previous infection with SARS-CoV-2 that's based not on antibodies, but on these longer-lived T cells. So tremendously exciting that in that short space of time, all of this research could take place and even lead to the launch of a new test. Of course, that was only possible because the collaboration had been in place for several years, and we'd been working on other diseases like Lyme's disease, so we could take the same technology and quite quickly repurpose it. So I think, you know, one of the few positive benefits to come out of the COVID pandemic was this really unprecedented level of global scientific collaboration. So very early in the pandemic, Adaptive and Microsoft expanded their partnership to set up a study called Immune Race, with the goal of enrolling thousands of individuals who'd been infected by or exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so the data from this study, combined with data from a dozen clinical partners around the world, has now been available publicly in a database called Immune Code to allow other researchers to conduct similar research and hopefully take us all to a much better place, both for this pandemic and for possible future ones. So that's just a glimpse of many, many exciting ways in which machine learning is impacting the real world. And I think we're just at the beginning of what's possible there. I thought I want to allow some time for questions, but I thought I'd just finish really by popping up a level and offering a few thoughts about the nature of research itself. So as a lab director, I think not only about the individual research projects, but even the nature of how we go about doing research and how we organize ourselves. And particularly in the light of what I call the real AI revolution, how should we think about the process of doing research? So this is a picture of our lovely building, which I haven't set foot in now for many months. This is in the centre of Cambridge, but I'm hoping perhaps sometime this summer we'll be able to return to the building and meet our colleagues again in person. And we have a mission for our lab. It's transforming the world through deep research. Now that mission statement was carefully chosen, and so I want to take a few minutes now, just in the remainder of this talk, to explain what we mean by transforming the world through deep research and why we've chosen that as our mission. Now, this has really been inspired by the thinking of somebody called Donald Stokes. So Donald Stokes studied the way research was conducted and organized, particularly in the United States, particularly in the aftermath of World War II. At the end of World War II, it was realized that technologies, the atomic bomb, radar, and many, many others had been pivotal in the Second World War. And as the United States was entering the Cold War, there was a lot of interest in how best to organize research in what was seen to be something of a sort of technology race. And so he conducted various studies, and he published this nice little book on science and technology innovation. It's a great little read. I do recommend it. You don't actually need to read it, because I'm going to explain now what the basic idea is. So this is the basic idea. So many people either implicitly or even explicitly think of research in terms of what's sometimes called a linear model. So at one end of the scale, we have basic research, and at the other end, we have applied research. And there's some notion that ideas originate at the left-hand end in basic research, and then they propagate along to the right-hand end where they become applied research, and eventually they create value for society. And then society will fund basic research, let's say through taxes and universities, and keep the cycle going. And that model is correct, and you can see plenty of examples of that model. But what Stokes really discussed in his book was that the model was incomplete, that actually the nature of research is rather more complex than that. And he illustrates his point by using some examples of real scientists and looking at the way they went about doing research. And so as an example of basic research, he chose the famous Nobel Prize winning physicist Niels Bohr. Now, everything I'm going to show you is taken from Donald's book, except for one thing. The one change I've made is I've replaced Niels Bohr with Marie Curie. And the reason is that although Niels Bohr had a Nobel Prize, Marie Curie had 2 Nobel Prizes. She had the Nobel Prize in physics and a Nobel Prize in chemistry. And so I thought it was time we had a bit of an upgrade. So Marie Curie will be our canonical example of somebody who does basic research. She was motivated simply by wanting a deeper understanding of the world, and in particular the phenomenon of radioactivity. That was her lifelong motivation. She was driven by curiosity and the desire to understand the world. Then as an example of applied research, Stokes chose Thomas Edison, famous, for example, for inventing the light bulb. His motivation was rather different, really. He wanted to run a business and make money and become rich. And he was aware that the concept of the light bulb was around, but it didn't work because the filaments kept burning out. And so what he did was employ hundreds of people in a sort of an almost industrialized research environment in which he systematically tested lots of different materials for a filament until he found one that worked well, and then he built a light bulb factory and went on to make lots of money. I oversimplify slightly, but the point is his approach to research was driven by the desire to solve a specific practical problem, and it didn't really matter how he got there. He wasn't particularly interested in understanding the phenomena, he was interested in solving the problem. So that's a good example of applied research. And then the third scientist that Stokes introduces is Louis Pasteur, the microbiologist. Now, Pasteur was also a very practical person. In fact, he was actually really a consultant. He was hired by the brewing industry to solve a very challenging problem, which was that batches of beer and wine and other fermentations would sometimes go sour, and they would be undrinkable, and they would have to be discarded. And this was proving to be very expensive for the brewing industry, and they called in Pasteur to help solve the problem. Now, he could have approached this the way Edison approached it. He could have tried lots of different things until he found something that worked, and then he could have collected his fee and the job would be done. But he took a very different approach. He really decided he wanted to understand the underlying phenomena by which the brews would go sour. And so he investigated the phenomena using microscopy, and he really laid the foundations for the field of microbiology. So he solved the problem for the brewing industry. He developed techniques like pasteurization. You buy milk today, it's probably been pasteurized, heat treated in a way that kills bacteria. So he produced very practical solutions, but he also developed very deep understanding of a new area of science. So the question is, where did he sit on this spectrum? Is he at the left end or the right end? Well, what Stokes argues is that this linear model is not incorrect, but it's an oversimplification. There's a lot of research that can't be understood on this linear axis. And he says, really, we need to think of research in a two-dimensional space. There are really 2 axes. There's the question of whether a scientist is seeking a fundamental understanding of the universe. And the answer is either yes or it's no. There's a separate question, which is whether there's a quest to solve a real-world application. Again, we could have a yes or we could have a no. So Marie Curie would sit up in the top left-hand quadrant. She wasn't particularly motivated by practical applications. She was driven by curiosity, and Stokes calls this pure basic research. So that's Marie Curie. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we have Edison. He just wanted to solve practical things, wasn't particularly concerned about understanding what was going on, just wanted something that would work. And Stokes calls this pure applied research. Now that opens up a third quadrant, a space that can be occupied by Louis Pasteur. And Stokes calls this use-inspired basic research. And it's really that quadrant that's the inspiration for the mission statement for our lab. Our goal is to transform the world. We're interested very much in things which have real world applicability at a global scale, but we want to do so through the mechanism of deep research. We want to transform the world through deep research. And in a way, it's tough because we have to do both things. We both have to do advance the state of the art in research and do things that are relevant in the real world. So it's almost the hardest of the quadrants to occupy. On the other hand, success there can be tremendously impactful because not only do you solve the problem that you set out to solve, but because you've gained a broader understanding, you often solve many other problems as well that you didn't think of initially. So that's our view of research. That's how we think of ourselves. All 3 quadrants are very important. A lot of academic research sits in the top left-hand quadrant, and that's incredibly important. It's part of our culture, and it does indeed, over time, lead to tremendous practical applications. It's extremely important. Equally, the bottom right quadrant, you'll find a lot of research groups. Let's say in Microsoft, we have a lot of research teams embedded within product teams who do very interesting research focused on particular applications. But Microsoft Research focuses in large part on that top right-hand quadrant, which I think is a very exciting place for an industrial research lab to be. So with that, let me just wrap up with a few final thoughts, then I'll be very happy to take some questions. So the first and foremost thing really is that I've talked about what I call the real AI revolution. It's a real excitement that I feel about the field of AI and machine learning, but it's not to do with artificial general intelligence. It's to do with a revolution in the way we create technology. Instead of programming a computer by hand, by coding in the algorithm, we do something quite different. We program the computer to be adaptive, and then we train it using large data sets. This is a tremendously exciting time to be in the field. It's also a tremendously important time. There are many, many challenges to go and address, whether it be climate change and sustainability, healthcare, global pandemics, and many, many others. And then really my final comment is please don't think of real world applications as some sort of second-class citizen to pure research. It's far from it. Tackling real world problems with determination can not only make the world a better place, it's also a very powerful motivator for fundamental research. So I've been in the field of machine learning now for close to 35 years, and I can confidently say this is by far the most exciting time to be in the field. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions. It looks like my video feed is frozen. Should I just try and let me just try restarting that. There we go.
Thank you very much, Professor, for such an engaging talk. I'm sure we all greatly benefited from this. So moving on to questions now.
So our first question is from Yais. He asks, this is related to the COVID-19 research you mentioned. The question is the t-test precise enough to distinguish between COVID-19 and other coronaviruses? Do you have any data on that?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm not the expert on this. So take my answer as a guess, not as anything definitive. Talk to Adaptive Biotechnologies if you really want to understand this. But it's a reasonably specific test because it's based on these T-cell receptors, which tend to be fairly specific. So in a way, I almost thought you were going to ask the other question, which is how good is it distinguishing between different variants of COVID-19? And perhaps that's in a way that's more interesting. So I think I'll stop by just saying that the general answer is it's a very specific kind of test. And so perhaps in a way, the more interesting question is how good is it distinguishing between different variants of COVID-19? And the answer to that almost certainly depends on how significant the variants are, because there are lots of genetic variations in the SARS-CoV-2 virus, many of which have very little practical relevance. They don't influence the infectivity, the infection rate, or the effect of vaccines and so on. But some variants could be more significant, and it's a very interesting question to understand how the test can detect those. But the nice thing is that once we have the genetic sequences, it's then relatively straightforward to rerun the statistical machine learning algorithms and revise the test. So in a sense, the test is, in a sense, a software test. The sequencing technology is generic, and then it really changes in the software, which should be relatively quick to make. Great question there.
Thank you, Professor. So next we have a question from Professor Clara. She says, what is the external environment needed for the holographic storage to have low error rate and loss of data?
The external environment was the question?
What is the external environment needed for the holographic storage to have low error rate and loss of data?
Oh, to have no error rate. I guess I'm not quite sure what the environment means here, but I guess it's the, what are the sort of the parameters? It's really, you can always get to effectively zero error rate. It's a great question because obviously you can just pile in more error correcting code. Obviously, and of course I'm talking to many experts I appreciate in the audience here, you always want errors, because if you don't have errors, you should simply increase the data density until you start to get errors. Then you use error correction to get rid of those errors again. And eventually, when you drive the error rate too high, you need so much error correcting code that the payload becomes smaller and smaller, and you actually start to lose again. So the optimum will occur at some error rate, and that error rate won't be zero. It'll be a non-zero error rate. And so that's one of the many parameters that we're trying to optimize in this nonlinear space. I can't give you specific numbers, mainly because I don't have them to hand. I'm not working directly on the project, but as I said, the project is now in the public domain. We're very happy to talk about it, but the precise numbers that we're achieving in terms of bit error rate and throughputs and latency and so on, those numbers would still be confidential. But we're making very rapid progress, and it's a very exciting project. I mean, I love it. It's like something out of Star Trek, right? We're going to store data as holograms in a crystal. I mean, wonderful, getting away from these spinning bits of magnetic disk. I mean, we've stored data in magnetic domains now for like 7 decades or something. It's about time we had some new technology, I think.
I agree. I was just wondering, disks have to be cooled. So I was just wondering if that particular holographic storage has to be also considered in terms of cooling, certain temperatures that have to be there.
Yeah, there's no cooling involved in the technology that we're exploring at the moment, but of course, the disks are a moving target as well. They're constantly improving, and they're actually very sophisticated. I mean, I rather poured scorn on them, really, but I mean the sophistication of the engineering behind the magnetic disk technology is quite extraordinary, and they're getting better all the time. So it's yeah, but I think the competition between these technologies is very healthy. So.
We have a next question from Adarsh related to the same technology. What is the data per unit volume that can be stored in that crystal?
Oh, that's a great question. I can't answer that. Again, for the reason as I said, I don't have the data to hand, and I think what I can say is that the kinds of numbers that we're achieving right now are sufficiently exciting that we're pressing ahead with the technology, but we certainly don't have a time frame yet on which we'll see this deployed. So it's still very much a research project. In other words, we're not yet at the kinds of parameter. You can imagine there's a multi-dimensional space, and there's a sort of a region in that space. And if we can enter that region, we have something that will be very exciting. We can start to scale it up and industrialize it. And we're not there yet, but we're seeing good progress, and we've got lots of ideas for how we can continue to make progress. So it's still an exciting research project. We're not yet at the numbers that we would need to make it a practical technology, but the precise numbers are the one aspect of the project that's still confidential for, I think, probably fairly obvious reasons.
Thank you, Professor. So there's a question from Anu. Thank you for sharing Microsoft's joint work with adaptive strategies. How do you think AI is going to change our understanding of basic biology questions? Will industries like Microsoft be interested in immune-related questions after COVID?
Oh, tremendous question. Yes, fantastic. I mean, tremendously exciting. This is going to be a big growth area for us. The work with adaptive biotechnologies is just one of the dimensions that we're exploring. I'm particularly excited about the role of large-scale compute, not just machine learning, but machine learning augmenting large-scale compute, making it more efficient. Biology is just mind-bogglingly complex, and we can use computation to get insights into biology, techniques such as molecular dynamics and so on. And it's an area that we're extremely interested in. And so in a way, it's a sort of a spin out from the capabilities that we and others have built over the last few years. I mean, we work very closely with OpenAI. We have a deep partnership with them. We provide the supercomputing technology to them, and that causes us to push on the frontiers of very large scale GPU arrays, and there's the cutting edge of machine learning. And that's exactly the technology you need to do these large-scale simulations, detailed simulations of molecular dynamic systems for life sciences. So I think that's a field that we're just scratching the surface of. I feel very confident that if we chatted again in the next 5 years, we'd see some real advances in that space. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the answer. Our next question is from Dr. Vijay Gurbani. The question is, given the increasing size of training parameters, the reality in models like GPTN, Anusha, you remove the question. So the the question is that given the increasing size of the, okay, see. Yeah. Given the increasing size of models like GPTN, training such models is concentrated in the hands of few companies. Do you see such concentration of intellectual activity in the hands of few companies being problematic? And do you think these companies will become gatekeeper of technology?
No, actually, I see precisely the opposite. At least if I think of Microsoft, I can't speak on behalf of other technology companies, but Microsoft has a particular business model, and the business model, the mission of Microsoft all up is empowering people and organizations to be successful and then sharing in the success. And so Microsoft's business is selling technologies and services, including large-scale compute, to an incredibly broad range of customers. And so really, one of the great things that Microsoft is doing in this space is developing these cutting-edge technologies and then making them available through the Azure cloud as services for people to use. And I think it's actually very democratizing. If you think about the cost of the infrastructure, we're talking about buildings the size of aircraft hangars rammed full of storage and networking and compute using state-of-the-art silicon. The infrastructure cost is enormous. I mean, these are the sorts of things which previously would have been done by not just by nations, but by nations collaborating together. When I was a PhD student, there was the European teraflop initiative. We wanted to build a teraflop scale machine. It took many, many European countries coming together to pool resources to build such a supercomputer. The great thing about the cloud is very elastic. You can rent the compute you need for the period you need it. And then when you're finished, you're done. It's somebody else's problem. You walk away. So from the user's point of view, you can access these very capital intensive facilities, but just for the period of time or the amount of compute that you need for your project. You don't have to make the capital investment. So from the user's point of view, it's a great deal. You couldn't possibly afford it, say a university department couldn't afford to build a whole data center on that scale. From Microsoft's point of view, it's also great as well, because we can build out this and have amortize the huge capital cost over many, many different customers, including internal customers. So I think under that business model, I think the cloud is very much a democratizing force for these large-scale compute clusters.
Thanks, Professor. So Dr. Norman has asked this question. Do you see an interplay between machine learning and advances in quantum computing advances?
Yep, and I think that's related to, can we use quantum computing to do machine learning? I think it is a very exciting frontier, and it's a very active research frontier. I think quantum computing is, in one sense, I'm very excited about it. My PhD was in quantum field theory, and so I've always followed with great interest developments in quantum computing. Quantum computing is tremendously challenging in getting it to work in reality and getting it to scale. So we've seen steady progress and development, but it's clearly still a good number of years away before we see large-scale quantum computers. And by the time we get to hundreds of effective qubits, we already have machines that are capable of doing things, calculations that couldn't really be done by any conventional computer in any reasonable amount of time. And so it opens up new possibilities. But really, things get interesting when you have millions or billions of qubits. And we just don't have any technology yet that scales out to that scale. When we do, of course, it'll impact on the things we talked about earlier around molecular biology, immunology, understanding life sciences. Then I think there'll be a tremendous impact there, material science and so on. So it's a very exciting frontier. And yes, there will be a very interesting intersection between machine learning and quantum computing. I think that's still a few years away. Very exciting research frontier.
Thank you very much. I think we are past the times, so we'll just have one last question. So this question is from Professor Wang. He thanks you for the insightful talk. You mentioned that a lot of human expert knowledge is based on experience. I was wondering how we could enable machines to learn from experience as humans rather than purely from data, so that machines can generalize to novel scenarios. So how to learn from humans?
It's such a great question. I mean, there's this interesting sort of dichotomy. On the one hand, this is a tremendously exciting time for the field. We're seeing machine learning advance at this tremendous pace, tackle all kinds of things that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. And yet when you step back from the sort of heady excitement and look at what's really going on, it's really a tiny wedge of let's say, the capabilities of the human brain. There's some very specific kinds of things that machine learning is really, really exceptionally good at, and way outperforming humans in many cases. But the rich capabilities of human cognition is way, way broader. And that's why in very few cases are we replacing humans. We're really amplifying the capabilities of people along specific axes. And that human understanding, that human expertise, and just the human aspect. And come back to the medical example. You know, if I have a lesion or a tumor or something, I want to know. I want medical treatment, then of course I want the best possible diagnosis. So that comes from a neural network. I'll have it from a neural network. That's great. But then if I'm diagnosed with cancer, what happens next? I want to talk to a real live human being, because it's not just about optimizing a care pathway. It's about a human experience of suffering from cancer and wanting treatment and wanting to be able to engage with a human expert in that space. So in terms of the ability of machines to learn, there are, again, lots of exciting frontiers around low shot learning, few shot learning, generalizing from few examples. I think that'll be an area where we'll continue to see very rapid progress as we scale up models. I mean, these language models, the idea of pre-training is proving to be tremendously powerful. That's really revolutionized natural language understanding in the last few years. And there'll be spillover effects into other domains, computer vision and so on. So it's a really great question. And I think we'll continue to be inspired by the capabilities of the human brain for many years to come. It'll be many, many decades, I predict, before we come close to matching human cognition in its full, rich variety.
Thank you very much, Professor. I really wish we had more time, but currently it's 11 p.m. in the UK, so we should definitely wrap up. So with that, let's thank Professor Bishop once more, and we're at the end of today's talk. So thank you everyone for attending as well. I have a few announcements to make. So I have posted the GatherTown link to our virtual CSL lobby. Please feel free to enter the space for some social interactions. I would also encourage everyone to join us tomorrow for the conference. We have the COVID-19 session in the afternoon, and other events include the networking and decentralized system session and the poster and robotics session. Please have a look at our website for more details. With that, we'll like to conclude. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much, Professor Bishop. It was a real pleasure and honor to have you here.
Thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Great questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Clara.
Thank you.